Oh, Doctor. Early stumbles, I say. Yeah, classic Doctor Who review is back. I've talked about why I've started doing reviews again. There's a video in the main channel if you're confused about that. But in any case, Fifth Doctor time. This one was voted on by my supporters over at Patreon. Link in the description. I'll bring it up again at the end of the video. 4 to Doomsday. So this is the second adventure of the Fifth Doctor, but I also happen to know the first one filmed. They actually did an interesting thing that I think was quite smart, which was to have Castrovalva, which was Peter Davison's first full serial, be filmed later in the block of filming because he was going to have to play a Doctor who didn't quite have a sense of himself yet. And you can't really do that properly if you don't know how you're going to end up playing him later. So in order to factor all that in so that he could play the wonky version of the character, he needed to settle on the stable version of the character first. So this was actually the first one filmed. And it's all right. I kind of feel like this one is forgotten a little bit. When it comes to classic Doctor Who episodes, you've got your absolute stone cold classics. You've got your oddities. You've got your absolute garbage fires. But then there's stuff that just kind of works. Yeah, that worked. But it also doesn't stick with you super well. I feel like 4 to Doomsday is one of those. That having been said, I actually like the Fifth Doctor a bit better in this than I often do. There's a specific trait that he carries with him in this episode that gets highlighted that I feel faded with time, and it was something he kind of dropped later on. He's very smiley in this story. One of the first things he does when they end up on this ship, him, Nyssa, Tegan, and Adric, I'll come back to the companions. They end up on this ship, and one of the first things he does is finds this camera. It's kind of a camera drone, and he just smiles at it directly down the camera. We see him smile a lot, and he actually points out at one point that he does it. That he does it because smiling is disarming, and it buys him time. So he's visually a bit more pleasant in this, but at the same time, since he identifies it as just a thing he's doing and not really meaning, it also gives you a sense of his duplicity, and that stuff's cooking in the background behind it. I actually quite like that. It stood out to me, and I feel like I haven't seen a ton of smiliness from him in subsequent stories to this. I'll try and watch for it more now that I've seen it highlighted here, but I feel like this faded with time, which is a shame because I kind of like it. The companions. So, these are the days of a crowded TARDIS, which is actually another one of the issues I tend to have with the Fifth Doctor's era. He always had a very crowded TARDIS, and I feel like he never really had a definitive companion. He always had groups. He didn't form especially strong individual connections with any one of them. This was actually also a problem I kind of had with the 13th Doctor. But here we have Tegan and Nyssa, who are the newest additions, and then you have Adric. And there's kind of problems with all three. Different problems, at least, so they're not redundant. In the case of Tegan, like, she just super doesn't want to be there, which, like, that's fine. They were trying to get her back to Heathrow so she could do her job as a flight attendant. But, like, the thing is, it's very clear that in this story in particular, Tegan has been designated as the one who needs the most stuff explained to her. Therefore, they kind of play up the idea that she doesn't get it and she doesn't understand what's going on. And she's the one who's always prompting to ask questions or to say something that is very clearly wrong so that other characters can correct her. She becomes the vehicle for so much of the exposition because Nyssa and Adric are ostensibly more learned and intellectual characters who theoretically wouldn't need as much explained. So she's very, very heavily being used to fill that role here. And to do that kind of more than almost anything else, to the point that she actually basically gets shoved in a cupboard at a few points. Not literally a cupboard, but like she gets shoved in a room and left behind. And later on, she ends up in the TARDIS by herself. It seems very clear that when the story doesn't need her asking questions, they kind of don't really want her there at all. And they just kind of shove her away. Nyssa, there's a couple of odd things about Nyssa. The first is she keeps getting referred to as a girl. I forget how old Nissa's supposed to be, but especially with Adric right there, who is clearly young. She does not read at an age where like girl but not woman, or and treating her like she's young doesn't make sense when Adric's right there and he's clearly much younger than her. So that's one of the things that's a little odd about her. In some ways, she is at times a little redundant to Adric because they both have a similar knowledge base, although they have very different personalities. And in the case of Adric, his personality is insufferable little shit. Oh, wow. Wow. Here's the thing. I've only seen a handful of stories that feature Adric up to this point, and I have never really liked him, but I've kind of been like, he's fine. He's okay. Like, I thought he worked fine in Kinda. Earthshock, decent enough. This, though, oh, he's got some lines in the first episode. Misogynistic little twerp. He's got some incel-sounding stuff going on. And there's a bit that happens later on. Basically, he gets completely brought in on the villains. I'll get to the villains. On the villains' plot and what it is they're doing and why they say they're doing it. And he goes in so hard, like, oh, yes, I see. That is a good thing. He goes in on that so hard, I was positive it was an act. I was positive he had to just be playing this up to try and get on the inside. No, we find out later he genuinely thinks all this is a good idea. And he was genuinely bought in. I was like, oh my gods. Oh no. Like it was so foolish. I thought the only way he could be doing this is if it's a ploy, and it wasn't. Even for a character as young as he was supposed to be, no. Thankfully, the doctor does give him a dressing down and flatly tell him to shut up later on, which is kind of nice. It brought to mind "Shut Up, Wesley" from Star Trek Next Generation. It's just cathartic to hear. But yeah, Adric's bad in this. He's not good. The villains are kind of interesting. So we have three. We have Monarch, who's the one, heading everything, and we have his two, I guess, sort of his right and his left hand, which is Persuasion and Enlightenment. Those are basically nicknames because one is the Ministry of Enlightenment, the Minister of Enlightenment, the other is the Minister of Persuasion. First of all, how intimidating a title is that, Minister of Persuasion? But over time, what we learn about them and what they are trying to do and accomplish, and they kind of bear some similarities a little bit to the Cybermen. And spoiler warning, for stuff that happens a little bit later in some of the later reveals, I guess. Overall, this is fine if you want to go ahead and watch it. But from here on, there'll be spoilers. They bear a certain resemblance to the Cybermen a little bit in that they are machines and they have had their, most of them are machines. I'll come back to that too. They've had their thoughts and their minds and their intelligence basically loaded onto chips and stuck in bodies and put false skin on them. And what's interesting is that they have a similar overall goal to the Cybermen, the idea of, they want to get to Earth and convert everybody. But they come at it from a different angle. They come at it from, basically the position of privilege, like a genuine belief that this is better, and it was arrived at over time, almost kind of organically, as a philosophical notion, flesh is weak. We think back to the flesh times and everything was worse. This is better, and we want to improve everybody's lives. And at least some of them, to some degree, seem to believe that, at least a bit. Whereas the Cybermen, they were created out of desperation. If we don't do this to ourselves, we are going to die. And then once they have done that and they've had their emotions and their humanity stripped out, they don't understand why it's not okay to do that to other people. Whereas these folks seem to genuinely think, at least to a degree, that they are doing humanity and anyone else they do this to a favor. So I did say one of them is a little bit more organic. We find out towards the end that Monarch still is partially organic, and I feel like that was a writing contrivance so that they had the means to defeat him, because they basically have this kind of it's like a compression. Basically, they shrink him. But it's meant for organics, and for it to work on him, he can't be all machine. So I feel like that's the only reason that's the case, except that hypocrisy actually fits him. His arrogance, this idea of, this is what I will do to all of you and your lives will be better. Oh, great. You gonna do it? Not fully, no. Like that kind of hypocrisy and arrogance actually fits the kind of character that he is. Because he is this mix of very genuinely believing that he's right, but also very clearly being petty and being incredibly susceptible to having his ego stroked. Again, a reason I thought Adric was faking it. There's another aspect to this, which is that there's all these figures from different points in Earth's history in different parts of the world who are on the ship. I mean, technically they are basically android replications with the memories of people taken from Earth. And it's an interesting mix. So we have some folks from ancient China. We have some folks from the Mayan civilization. We have Aborigines from Australia. Interesting note on that, Tegan speaks to one of them, like in his native tongue. I don't know, especially at the time in the 80s, how common it was for white Australians to be able to speak the Aboriginal language. But if it was semi-common at the time, that's a fun fact. And if it wasn't, I think it speaks really well of her character that she would go out of her way to learn that. Either way, I actually kind of thought that was kind of neat. The cultural sensitivity on this, I'm not in a position to say how accurate the depictions of any of this are. In particular, there's a lot of like cultural dancing that happens at various points from pretty much all of them. So I guess that's the first thing. They pretty much all get equal highlight, which feels nice. And again, how respectful and true to reality the dancing is, I don't know. I'm a little bit hopeful in that the actual dance performers, I checked, like, this is just a little bit of detective work on my part, and then an assumption. I checked their IMDb, and most of them have no other credits aside from this, which would lead me to believe that there's at least a good chance that these were like actual groups from these cultures who like maybe toured and did, sharing their culture. Because, you get that. You get groups who, do this kind of performance, and sometimes they stay in their own land to do it. Sometimes they travel to do it. I think it's at least possible that was where these folks came from, and it might have been more authentic. I do know that they did actually get an actor of Chinese descent to play the Chinese character. And while they did not get an Aborigine to play that character, they got a Nigerian. I still have reason to believe this might be on the better side of this kind of thing. It does get a little bit squidgy because we have Bygone, who is a Greek, and he is unfortunately kind of elevated above the rest, and he is uniquely white because basically everybody who's on board the ship knows what Monarch and his hench cronies are up to and planning to do and are on board with it. And it's basically said that Bygone went against it because his culture is the only one that wouldn't accept something like this. And they bring up the idea of like Grecian democracy and whatnot. And like that, don't love that. There's a sense of superiority behind that. Like, strictly speaking on paper, I kind of get the logic, but the idea that like no other culture besides Greece and the whitest guy there of those already assembled on the ship is the only one who stood up, and everyone else's culture meant they would just go along with this and kowtow to it. I'm like, don't like that. Don't feel good about that. But again, like, they are treated more or less respectfully. None of them are fodder. That's another nice thing. None of them just get killed left or right. That said, speaking of characters getting killed, the action scenes aren't great. They're really badly staged. Like, there's a fight between Adric and Persuasion, and like Persuasion gets knocked down, and I don't know why. Like, I literally don't know what happened to him. He just gets knocked down, and Adric's shooting a weapon at him, but it looks like it's going through him. and it's not slowing him down. Like, I don't get what the heck's going on. There isn't a ton of action in this, thankfully. What little action there is isn't great. I actually really like the set. It's a very complete set, and it feels big. So I actually like that quite a bit. It was a good. I don't know if they shot on location, but either completely built set or a dress location. It's solid. It works. It has that sense of like everything having some kind of function and purpose, or at least connecting to something that does. So yeah, I like the setting a fair bit. And as I said, I actually like Davison in this a bit better than I usually do, largely for that willingness to smile and just having just a little bit better banter than he often has. But overall, I get why this is kind of a little bit of a forgotten one. While there are some decent aspects to it, there isn't anything that's like, whoa, and the overall concepts aren't super unique, not even within Doctor Who, not even at the time. But it gets the job done. It's solid enough, but, the cracks are definitely there. It's doing its best, and coming off of Castrovalva, which is significantly stronger than this, it's not a complete faceplant. It just doesn't quite live up to that standard. But that's for the Doomsday. Have you watched or rewatched this particular classic era Doctor Who story anytime recently? Well, if you have, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe. Also big help. Don't worry too much about it, though. We take a relaxed attitude around here, so you can come on back next time you need a break. A special thanks to my highest supporting patrons, Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Ruth, Oliver B., Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Pranabulax the Poodle, Robin Powell, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Dave Hall, and Rosalind Bennett. You'll see a bunch of other names down there as well. There's plenty of things to get on the Patreon, and yeah, you can hear me attempt to say your name without embarrassing myself. Check out the rewards, and thank you for everyone who supports this.